Well, shares in Santos today slumped heavily after news this morning that merger discussions between Woodside and Santos have been called off. Both companies put out statements saying they'd called off the discussions. Tellingly, perhaps, Woodside put out its statement an hour before Santos. But investment managers have for months been warning about this merger, suggesting it would not create value for shareholders. And one of those is one of Australia's most senior asset managers, Simon Mawhinney, Managing Director and Chief Investment Officer of Allan Gray, who joins me now. Many thanks for your time, as always, on the program. Just explain why you think that this merger between these two giants would not have created value.
Ross, thank you for having me. It would have created value for some people, mainly investment bankers, lawyers, consultants, etc. But for shareholders, it's not clear that any value would have been created. There's no overlap between the assets, and therefore little by way of synergies could be achieved out of this. And one of our biggest issues was that this merger achieved something that shareholders could achieve on their own, absent a merger, being diversification of production. So there was nothing really compelling that combining these two companies together would achieve. And if anything, there might have been some forced sales of gas assets from Eastern Australia.
So in other words, as you point out here, the shareholders effectively could have owned Woodside and Santos shares, had diversification of where gas was being produced around the world, and achieve exactly the same aim as a merger would have anyway.
That's our view. I mean, of course, in many senses, we could be wrong, but we do own both companies. We actually own both Santos and Woodside, yet we were still opposed to a merger between the two companies for the very reasons I just mentioned. Yes, I agree with you.
Okay, so I noticed that today Meg O'Neill, the chief executive of Woodside, said she believes there is still opportunity for value to be created by deals in the gas space around the world. So this doesn't preclude either company from going outside and providing another merger where there could be decent synergies.
Absolutely. I think this is an ordinary course of business for these companies. There's quite a lot of consolidation in the sector overseas. But in all cases, there needs to be a compelling reason for two companies to get together. And where that's the case and where synergies can be created and essentially passed on to shareholders, those are compelling reasons to merge. And in this instance, we don't think those existed. Now, of course, we don't know why this merger or this almost merger failed. It's very difficult to know what happened. And indeed, as you mentioned earlier, it's hard to know who actually walked away. So there are a lot of questions and few answers. But if nothing else, we're surprisingly relieved that the discussions have ceased.
One thing you can always look at is the stock market, and you can see that Woodside shares were slightly higher today, but Santos shares were significantly lower on this announcement. That would suggest that maybe it was the Santos shareholders who ultimately might have been doing better out of the deal had it gone through.
Well, I think that's the case, but it's also important not to read too much into these things, as there would have been a lot of ARB funds who jumped onto the Santos register expecting a deal, only to be disappointed, and they are notoriously short-term investors, and so they would be heading for the exits as we speak.
So there's one thing also, that the Barossa project, which has been controversial, especially amongst many environmental groups, got the green light and is going to continue its development for Santos. That only came last week. Of course, that's in the Northern Territory. Do you think that its approval made any difference to these conversations?
I don't. I don't believe it should have. I think it is a positive development for Santos and one we're very supportive of. However, when you look at the two companies, Woodside also has been caught up in similar issues with its Scarborough project, and both of those two projects are almost equally important to the other. So the Barossa news is good for Santos, but it also creates a precedent for the likely path for the Scarborough project for Woodside. And so it's not clear that that in itself would have been a compelling reason to proceed with the merger.
Well, the one thing we do know is those conversations are off. And so as a result, the two giant Australian gas producers are still independent entities. Simon Mawhinney is the Managing Director and Chief Investment Officer at Allan Gray. And Simon, many thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Ross.